Bill Bachman here with another lesson. This one is almost a little bit esoteric, but it's going to make you think a little bit. We're going to talk about the 4 accent tap scenarios. Now everybody kind of knows the idea behind the 4 basic strokes. The free stroke or full stroke, then the downstroke, which stops down, the tap, which starts and ends down there, and the upstroke, where you simply pick it up. Now that works well for a lot of things, and it's the fundamental that most people don't know that they can't do well. So assuming you really take the time to do that, then it's time to add some other techniques in order to negotiate different accent tap rudiments and patterns. So here we go. Try to track with me here. Here are 3 notes. You have a tap, an accent, and a tap. Now, right here, there's space between them, so we can simply do an upstroke, because there's time to lift up, a downstroke, since there's time to stop the stick down, and then a tap separately. Now, that's scenario number 1. Now, what if I do this, and there's no space between this? Now, this tap is going to be an upstroke, because there's time to lift it up. Then we have an accent, but there's no time to stop it, so we have to do what I call the no chop, flop, and drop. So here you go, boom, and you let just ba-ba-ba, like a decrescendo, where you try to emulate the low note, but there's not enough time to stop it. For instance, a flam tap at a medium tempo, you just sort of do the no chop, flop, and drop, and let it sort of fall down to emulate that. That's accent tap scenario number 2. Now number 3 is if we do this. Now, there's no time for an upstroke because you got to get right to that accent. And that's where, instead of picking up the stick from the wrist, we're going to do a molar whip. And by that, we throw the forearm and kick the back end of the stick up, and suddenly the stick is up and you're ready for your accent. Now, there's time to stop, so you play a downstroke which stops, and then you play your tap separately. So I call this the whip and stop. If you think about the inverted flam tap, that's a scenario where you have to whip it. Most people really struggle with that rudiment because they don't have that molar whip technique and they're trying to use wrist turn. So the flam gets wide and they stiffen up and it kind of wrecks itself and you can end up with tendinitis. Now, scenario 4 is where they're all adjacent to each other. So now there's no time to pick the stick up from the wrist via upstroke. There's no time to stop it via downstroke. So we need to whip up to the accent, and then no chop, flop, and drop out. So there's the molar whip and flop, is what I call that. So that's the 4th scenario. Now if you think about it, most people, they have a nice accent tap exercise that works this, sort of like the flam accent or paradiddle. A lot of them have that. But when you want to play anything with accents and taps fast and all kinds of other rudiments, you really need to have those techniques prepared. So ultimately, I think drumline should have exercises that cover each one of those 4 accent tap scenarios. When I did my book, Stick Technique, published through Modern Drummer, that the premise is there are 12 rudiments, and if you can play these 12 rudiments, you have the hand motions and techniques necessary to play everything else. And I realized I picked out 4 and only 4 flam rudiments, and it happened that those contained each of the 4 accent tap scenarios. So the first one is simply the downstroke, upstroke, the basic wrist strokes, the 4 strokes. So if we look at a flam accent, you can see there's time to lift up the stick and there's time to stop the stick. If I separate the hands, okay, a downstroke should not be a hard, punished, stiff stroke. It's just a stroke that ends down relative to where it started. And having the separation from there to the next thing, the tap and grace note combination, that's what's going to make the dynamic contrast happen. So there's your accent tap scenario number 1. Okay, now scenario number 2. This is where we have a tap and then an accent and we drop right to the next tap. So here there's no time to stop it. Like, so rather than be stiff and ugly, you need to sort of drop to it, right? The no chop, flop, and drop. And flam tap is the key rudiment where we're going to do this. So here are your flam taps. If we play them really slow, we could stop the stick and use the basic 4 strokes. And certainly everybody should do that and have those ready to go. But most tempos, you need to sort of do the no chop, flop, and drop. So if you look what each hand does, it's as if I'm playing 3s or a triple stroke roll, but I have no finger control chops. So no chop, flop, and drop. Most people struggle with this because they're trying too hard. You need to stop trying and just be as lazy as possible. And there's your flam tap. So that's scenario number 2. Now scenario number 3, here's where we have a tap right before an accent, and there's just not enough time to lift the stick via the wrist in order to get the stick height for that accent. So we're going to use a molar whipping motion instead. Now, I'm not going to do a full lesson on molar whipping techniques here because it's pretty involved. But the short of it is, you basically play from the forearm instead of the wrist. So if you use your wrist muscles at all, you actually kill the effect of the whip. So here, as you throw the forearm down, it naturally kind of kicks the stick up and the equal and opposite reaction happens. And suddenly your stick is up without you lifting the stick, right? It's that motion. So an inverted flam tap is the rudiment I chose for the molar whip and stop. So here it is. If you look at each hand, so most people try to do this using wrist turn. And slow, it's fine. But as you get faster, it starts to get stiff and tight, and the accent is delayed as you take the time to lift up the stick. So the opposite of that, instead of playing from the wrist, play from the forearm. And it becomes really, really easy to effortlessly throw your way to an accent. Okay, now, scenario 4 is where the 2 are adjacent. You have to whip to the accent and no chop, flop, and drop out. So I call that the whip and flop. Now, when people, here again, you use molar to whip to it. So it's going to look like this. If we did an accent and a tap back and forth. A lot of people love to demonstrate the whole, oh, sorry, rim shot. That combination, that's just one of thousands of things you can do with the molar whip and flop technique. The rudiment we're going to look at for this one is simply the flam. When you play flam slow, no problem to just use your wrist and go upstroke, downstroke. But fast, this is what happens. It gets tense, the flams get wide, it gets really ugly. So let's look at medium tempo hand-to-hand flams. If we take a hand away, there it is. So if you can play that coming from a forearm, and you can do it in 2 hands, there's your hand-to-hand flam. The way to learn this, of course, is go slow and practice the fast tempos technique slowly. So you would practice where you completely shut your hands off. So that is scenario 4. If you take exercises to develop each of these 4 accent tap scenarios, then there will really be nothing that you can't play extremely loose, extremely smoothly, and extremely fast. So there you go, get to it.